Chaucer, who was the right-hand man of Louis XV, he was the one that wrote the expulsion for the Jesuits out of France when the French Parliament wanted to kick them out also. And the French Parliament publicly burned all the works of the Jesuits on the court steps. Then you have Aranda, who was the right-hand man of the King of Spain. I believe it was Charles III. And he is behind the formal expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain. And what we're talking about here in the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain and Portugal, this means all the holdings of Spain and Portugal, which goes into South America and North America. That meant that the Jesuits had to be expelled from all of South America. They had to be expelled from all the French holdings in America, which is why we understand the Louisiana Purchase. When Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, then the expulsion of the Jesuits was no longer in effect once that land transfer was in U.S. hands.
Really?
Yes, and so we see that Jefferson was most assuredly an agent of the Jesuits working to help them stay in North America through the Louisiana Purchase for the meager price of $15 million. So we understand the flow of history in the light of the suppression of the Jesuit order from various countries. So at this great Masonic schism, for example, at this time in the mid-1750s, by 1773, the Pope, after a 4-year investigation of the Jesuit order, he has his bull of extinction. The Jesuits call it a brief. It was a bull. It's the bull Dominic Ac Redemptor Noster, and it was the bull of extinction, suppression, and extinction forever. That the Jesuits could never, ever come back to life, that they were forbidden to even talk about this suppression, that the Jesuits were banished as far as being part of the papacy, and so as a result, the Jesuits now are not part of the Vatican Empire. So it's in the light of the suppression and extinction of the Jesuits by the Pope himself, for which he was later poisoned, that we understand the French Revolution. Because the very monarchs that suppressed the Jesuits were kicked off their thrones by Napoleon.
Wow.
And then after they were punished, then Napoleon sacrifices his army he first sacrifices his army there when he's retreating from Russia, if you read Tolstoy's War and Peace. But then he also sacrifices his army at Waterloo because the monarchs at the Council of Vienna had come to terms with the papacy. And so we understand Napoleon was nothing more than a creature of the Jesuits. He came around out of Corsica. The Jesuits were confined to Corsica during their suppression. They were all rounded up and taken by ships of Spain back from South America, and they were thrown on the shores of Corsica there off the coast of France. And that's where they stayed until really Napoleon Bonaparte came to power, and then they used him, and that's why Napoleon had such victories. The Jesuits controlled the opposing side to make sure Napoleon could always win until ultimately he set back in Moscow.
Wow. I mean, one thing that comes to mind here is speaking about there are some really interesting similarities between Napoleon and Hitler, of course, and one is also the fact that Napoleon, just as Hitler, went basically, dragged all of their troops up to Russia and basically let all of them freeze to death up there.
That's correct.
I mean, that's just amazing to me how that can happen. I mean, so this is about on the first level to take over countries, conquer in that sense, but then also to later sacrifice the powerful armies of these countries so they can't become a powerful enemy to the Vatican?
Well, that's right. As I cover in my book, I show that, for example, Napoleon, after he was used to destroy the Dutch Republic in Holland, that was ended in 1806. That Napoleon ended the Pope's Holy Roman Empire. I think that was around 1806 too. That the Pope suppressed the Teutonic Knights that were later revived in the 1830s and ultimately went on to be the SS under Hitler. That Napoleon was used to kick the Braganza dynasty off the throne in Portugal, and they had to flee into exile into South America because the Braganzas expelled the Jesuits from Portugal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That Napoleon drove the Spanish king from his throne and created the Spanish Republic as a result of the Spanish king kicking out the Jesuits out of Spain. And the other thing the Spanish king did was he gave quite a few $1 million in gold to the American Revolution, which was a Protestant revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jesuits were furious over that, even though King George III, that was controlled by the Jesuits, was unable to stop the success of the revolution. So, as Napoleon was then used to punish all the enemies of the Jesuit, including the Pope himself. Remember, the first Pope, Pius VI, he died after he was captured. And then the Pope Pius VII, he was in prison for 5 years, imprisoned by Napoleon for 5 years until he agreed to restore the Jesuit order. And when he restored the order in 1814, he was freed from prison.
Really?
And so the Jesuits then got back the whole Vatican Empire, because once you control the Pope, you control all the Vatican Empire. And in 1870, when the Jesuits were behind the infallibility of the Pope with the First Vatican Council, they then solidified all power into the hands of the Pope so that the Black Pope could control the entire papacy through one man. So the Jesuits then, after they used Napoleon for this purpose, and what does Napoleon do? He sacrifices his army in Russia.
Yeah.
And they're not only Frenchmen, they're Germans. Many of them are Protestants, revolting against these Catholic tyrants who had punished and persecuted our brethren for many years. And so they were ignorantly believing that Napoleon was truly fighting the papacy and fighting the Roman Catholic monarchs, when in fact they were being used to punish the monarchs that had punished the Jesuits. And by the way, the Rothschilds are now the Jesuits' former bankers, because the Jesuits had to find keepers for their treasury, so they committed lots of their treasure to the Rothschilds. That's why today the Rothschilds are nothing more than the keepers of the Vatican treasury.
Let's go into that, because that's a fascinating subject. In a way, of course, this also ties us into a bit, into Zionism and all of that area of this. But exactly what you just said there is something that I've heard about it before, and I've in a way also kind of suspected it, because even though the Rothschilds isn't a very to that extent a very public dynasty, people know about them, of course, but they're not very much in the limelight to that extent. But what I soon started to suspect was that, okay, these guys probably are just handling the money for someone, and that is exactly what you're saying here, right?
That's correct, because the Rothschilds are Masons. They're high-level Scottish Rite, Grand Orient, doesn't really matter, high-level Freemasons, intimately connected with the Illuminati, which the Jesuits started in 1776 to use as the vehicle to introduce the French Revolution into France. And so the Rothschilds are nothing more than the Masonic Illuminati bankers for the Jesuit order. And we see this quite clearly, for example, in the financing of the Pope's nation of Israel. Now, I'm all for the Jews, the racial Jews, owning and living in their own land that has been given to them pursuant to Genesis chapter 15. It is their land. So I am completely for the Jews living in their own land, and that the Arabs should be removed to Jordan, to Syria, to the other nations. I regard the Arabs as having no right whatsoever to that land, and they need to leave, because God gave it to the Jews, the racial, physical descendants of Abraham, in Genesis chapter 15. But the papacy regards Israel as its kingdom of Jerusalem, as its revived kingdom of Jerusalem, because the Pope couldn't care less about the Jews. He wants to kill them all. But what is precious to the Pope and the devil that he serves is that city Jerusalem. Because remember, in Luke and Matthew chapter 4, the devil takes Christ up on the temple and says, "Cast yourself down, for it's written, the Lord will give his angels charge over you, unless you fall or stub your toe or dash your foot against a stone." So the devil tempted Christ to perform a miracle of jumping off the temple, and of course Christ refused to do it. But the devil wanted all authority, and he wants to rule the world through a Hebrew temple in Jerusalem. This is exactly what the Pope has wanted. This is the whole purpose for the Crusades. The purpose for the Crusades was to take back from the Muslims Jerusalem, that the Pope could Jerusalem, and God in his providence would never allow that to happen. That's why Jerusalem could never be taken away from the Muslims, except on the First Crusade. And they only held it for a few years there, and when they held it, they didn't hold it for the Pope. So that's what the end game is. And so the Jesuits used the Rothschilds to set up one of the first settlements in Israel. So the Rothschilds, they finance what the Pope wants to do. Because ultimately, all the gold belongs to the papacy. Even the Pope says this, all the gold is mine. And the papacy controls all the paper currencies of the nations. The papacy controls the world economic capital is London. That's where they determine the value of all the currencies every day. And so the Jesuits control London through their Jesuit provincial there in London, and through the Archbishop of Westminster, who is subject to the Jesuit provincial, and there they control all commerce. So yes, the Jesuits indeed have done this through using the Jews, these specific Jewish families, as their surrogates, and we see this in America today. For example, they're bringing down the World Trade Center. Who was the World Trade Center sold to before it was brought down?
Silverstein, right?
A Jew, Larry Silverstein, a high-level Masonic Jew. So it can look like to the world that the Jews brought down the World Trade Center. When in fact, and he collected, I forget, over $1 billion of insurance out of that.
Yeah, that's right.
So he benefits, but he benefits for the papacy because he's just one of the Pope's court Jews. Just like Arlen Specter, just like Charles Schumer, just like George Soros, they're all papal court Jews serving the Pope, but they're subordinate to the Jesuit order. They do not rule the Jesuit order.
So this is something for, are you saying that this is something for people to keep an eye on, to keep busy with, to keep looking at, the Jews or even then the Zionists in order to, see what the boogeyman or the bad guy is, so to speak?
Well, right. We always wonder, because Germany, the German people, because the Bible was no longer circulated in Germany, the German people bought the lie that the Jews wrecked the German economy in the 1920s. When the fact of the matter was, it was white Roman Catholic Gentiles who destroyed the economy of Germany. Okay? And so we cannot be duped into that mistake, because if we do, then we will persecute the Jewish race in our country, and that will bring upon the curse of Genesis 12 into our country, the same curse that came into Germany that leveled the place by the end of World War II. So we don't want to do that. What we want to do is we want to blame these court Jews of the Pope who are traitors to their own people, who participated in the Eurasian Jewish Holocaust, men like Rudolf Kastner, who helped Eichmann and Kurt Becker round up 400,000 Hungarian Jews and send them to Auschwitz. And for this, Kurt Becker, he was killed by a former member of the Mossad on his doorstep before he could be prosecuted. So we have to remember these ties. And the works of Barry Chamish are absolutely correct. It's nothing fascists who rule Israel. They're ruling for the benefit of the Pope. King Juan Carlos, who's a Knight of Malta, Jesuit trained, is called the King of Jerusalem. And it's Shimon Peres that consults with Juan Carlos before he pulls one of his major stunts. So these Jews that are running Jerusalem are not ruling it for the benefit of the Lord's beloved Hebrew Jewish Israelitish people. They are ruling it for the benefit of the papacy. That's why they never, ever allow the agitation to cease, because the agitation produces more diplomacy, and the diplomacy is always to the benefit of Rome.
One thing again that comes up here is and I guess that this, again ties us back to the religious context of where this is going. But why bother about Jerusalem? I mean, what is it about this place that is so important for either if it's a philosophical idea or a religious idea? What do you think that is about?
Because there are two kingdoms, invisible kingdoms in this world. One is run by the risen Son of God at the right hand of his Father, and the other is run by the devil, who the Bible says